Love can be the most beautiful blessing, or the cruelest curse a man can bear. For Sir Kaelen, it became both when dark magic stole everything he held dear. He was once the kingdom's most celebrated knight, but 15 years ago an enemy raid destroyed his home and killed his childhood love. A terrible curse followed. Any woman he touched with love would die. Filled with guilt and fear, Kaelen swore never to let another woman into his heart. For 15 years, he lived alone, serving. Only his sword and duty. Then Lady Serenya arrived at court. She saw past his armor to the lonely man beneath and wasn't afraid of his curse. She feared only his refusal to live. But can love break a curse that has kept him isolated for 15 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Ravenshollow Castle buzzed with the familiar sounds of evening clinking goblets, muffled conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter from knights sharing tales of their latest exploits. Sir Kaelen Thorne sat at the far end of the hall, positioned deliberately where shadows fell longest and conversations reached him as mere whispers. His battle-worn sword rested against his chair, its leather-wrapped hilt smooth from years of faithful service, its blade bearing the honorable scars of countless battles fought in defense of the realm. At 30, Kaelen possessed the bearing of a man who had seen too much and said too little. His dark hair, now touched with premature silver at the temples, framed a face that might once have been called handsome. His fellow knights still spoke of the young warrior who had captured every maiden's attention 15 years ago, but that man seemed like a stranger now. The years of self-imposed isolation had carved deep lines around his gray eyes, and his smile, when it appeared at all, never quite reached those eyes that had witnessed too much loss. Still brooding in the shadows, Kaelen? Sir Aldrich's voice carried the warmth of old friendship as the older knight approached. Aldrich had been Kaelen's mentor since boyhood, a grizzled veteran with silver threading through his auburn beard, and wisdom earned through decades of service to the crown. He settled into the chair beside Kaelen with a grunt, his own sword bearing witness to a lifetime of battles. "I'd prefer to observe," Kaelen replied, his voice carrying that familiar tone of measured distance he had perfected over the years. "The hall provides entertainment enough without my participation." Aldrich studied his former pupil with knowing eyes. "You cannot hide from life forever, my boy. The king values your counsel, your brothers in arms respect your skill, yet you sit here like a ghost haunting his own funeral." The words stung because they held truth. Kaelen had indeed become something of a specter in his own life, moving through the motions of duty while keeping his heart locked away behind walls of guilt and fear. The other knights nodded respectfully when he passed, sought his tactical advice before difficult campaigns, and trusted him to guard their backs in battle. But none truly knew the man beneath the armor, and Kaelen preferred it that way. His fingers unconsciously traced a small locket hidden beneath his leather jerkin. A Kaelen, habit born of 15 years of secret mourning. Inside rested a miniature portrait of Lyanna, his childhood sweetheart, painted just weeks before the raid that changed everything. Her laughing blue eyes and golden curls remained frozen in time, a reminder of the life he might have lived and the happiness he dared not seek again. The memory of that terrible night still haunted his dreams. The village of Millbrook had been celebrating the harvest festival when the raiders struck. Foreign soldiers bearing strange banners had swept down from the northern mountains like wolves among sheep. Kaelen, barely 15 but already showing promise with a blade, had fought desperately to protect his family and his beloved Lyanna. But he had been just a boy facing seasoned warriors, and his best efforts proved insufficient against their superior numbers and dark magic. The enemy sorcerer, a gaunt figure in midnight robes, whose face remained mercifully blurred by time and trauma, had spoken words in a language that seemed to claw at the very air. As Lyanna fell beneath a soldier's blade, the sorcerer had pointed one skeletal finger at young Kaelen and pronounced a curse that would follow him for the rest of his days. Any woman he loved would meet the same fate as his first love. The magic had settled into his bones like winter cold, a constant reminder of the price of caring too deeply. Only Aldrich knew the full story, having been the one to find Kaelen 3 days later, half mad with grief and guilt, cradling Lyanna's lifeless form in the ruins of what had once been his home. The older knight had taken the broken boy under his protection, brought him to Ravenshollow, and helped him forge a new life from the ashes of the old. But even Aldrich's patience had limits when it came to his protege's stubborn refusal to truly live. "The curse," Kaelen began, but Aldrich raised a weathered hand. "The curse serves as your excuse now, not your burden," the older knight said with gentle firmness. "I watched you become the finest warrior in the kingdom, saw you earn the respect of every man in this hall, witnessed your courage in the face of dangers that would break lesser men. Yet you cannot find the strength to risk your heart again." Before Kaelen could respond, a commotion near the main entrance drew their attention. The great oak doors had opened to admit a small traveling party. 3 figures dusty from the road, their fine clothes marking them as nobility despite the wear of travel. 2 men flanked a woman whose presence seemed to command the attention of everyone in the hall. Lady Serenya Ashworth moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to both courtly elegance and practical necessity. Her auburn hair, braided with ribbons that had once been white but now showed the dust of many miles, caught the firelight as she surveyed the hall with intelligent green eyes. A silver rose brooch gleamed at her throat, its delicate petals catching and reflecting the light like captured moonbeams. She was perhaps 25, with the bearing of someone who had learned to rely on her own strength rather than the protection of others. "Lord Blackwood's daughter," Aldrich murmured, recognizing the heraldry on her escort's surcoats. "I heard she was coming to court, though the reasons were kept deliberately vague. Some business with the king regarding her family's holdings in the disputed territories." Kaelen watched with detached interest as the newcomers were greeted by court officials and guided toward the high table where they could be properly received. Lady Serenya moved through the introductions with practiced ease, but he noticed how her eyes continued to scan the hall, as if cataloging potential allies and threats with the instinctive wariness of someone who had learned not to trust appearances. Their eyes met across the crowded hall for just a moment, a brief connection that lasted no more than a heartbeat. But in that instant, Kaelen felt something stir in his chest that had lain dormant for 15 years. Not attraction, precisely, though Lady Serenya was undeniably beautiful. Rather, it was a recognition of something familiar in those green eyes. The look of someone who had known loss and survived it, who carried secrets and sorrows but refused to let them define her entirely. The moment passed, and Lady Serenya turned her attention back to the lord who was introducing her to various court dignitaries. But Kaelen found himself unable to look away, studying the way she held herself, the careful way she smiled at strangers while keeping her true thoughts hidden. There was strength in her posture and intelligence in her measured responses to the questions posed by curious courtiers. Dangerous territory, that, Aldrich observed quietly, having followed his student's gaze. "I know that look, Kaelen. I saw it once before, 15 years ago, when you first noticed a certain golden-haired girl at the Harvest Festival." Kaelen tore his attention away from the newcomer and fixed his mentor with a stern look. "You read too much into a moment's curiosity. I was merely observing our new guest, nothing more." "Of course," Aldrich agreed with the knowing tone of someone humoring a fool. "Though I might point out that you've observed her for longer than you've looked directly at anyone in years. And unless my eyes deceive me, She's been stealing glances in this direction as well. Indeed, when Kaelen allowed himself another quick look, he caught Lady Serenya's eyes on him again. This time, instead of turning away politely, she held his gaze for several seconds before offering the slightest nod of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone not watching for it, but it sent an unexpected warmth through Kaelen's chest. "I should retire," he said abruptly, rising from his chair and reaching for his sword. Dawn comes early, and Sir Marcus wants the new recruits tested on their sword work before the afternoon drills. Aldrich caught his arm gently, running away. "So soon? The evening has barely begun, and I was hoping you might join me for a game of chess later. It's been too long since we had a proper match. Another time, perhaps?" Kaelen's voice carried that familiar note of polite distance he used to keep people at arm's length. "Give my regards to Sir Marcus when you see him." As he made his way toward the hall side exit, Kaelen was acutely aware that he would have to pass relatively close to the high table where Lady Serenya was now seated. He kept his eyes forward, maintaining the disciplined bearing that had become second nature, but he could feel her attention on him like warmth from a fire. The silver rose brooch in her throat seemed to catch every flicker of candlelight, creating tiny flashes that drew the eye despite his best efforts to ignore them. Just as he reached the exit, he heard her voice for the first time clear and melodious, with an accent that spoke of education and refinement, but also hinted at harder experiences than most courtly ladies ever faced. "Sir Aldrich," she was saying to his mentor, who had apparently approached the high table after Kaelen's departure, "might I inquire about the knight who just left? I don't believe we were properly introduced." Kaelen paused in the shadow of the doorway, close enough to hear, but hidden from view. "That would be Sir Kaelen Thorne, my lady," Aldrich replied with careful diplomacy. "One of our finest warriors, though he tends towards solitude these days." "I see." There was something in her tone, not pity, but understanding. "He has the bearing of someone who has seen much sorrow. War does that to good men, I've noticed." "Indeed, my lady. Though in Sir Kaelen's case, the wounds run deeper than most battles inflict." Kaelen didn't wait to hear more. He slipped through the doorway and into the cool night air of the castle courtyard, his heart beating faster than it had in years. Something about Lady Serenya's presence had stirred feelings he had worked very hard to bury, and the prospect both terrified and intrigued him in equal measure. Above him, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human sorrows, and the curses that bound lonely nights to lives of solitude. But somewhere in the great hall behind him, a woman with intelligent green eyes and a silver rose brooch was asking questions about a man she had barely met. And for the first time in 15 years, Sir Kaelen Thorne wondered if his carefully constructed walls might not be as impregnable as he had believed. 3 days passed before fate forced another encounter. The autumn feast of St. Aldwyn provided the occasion, a formal dinner requiring the attendance of all knights currently in residence at Ravenshollow. Kaelen had spent those 3 days deliberately avoiding the common areas where he might encounter Lady Serenya, but duty offered no such escape from social obligations. He arrived at the great hall precisely on time, neither early enough to seem eager nor late enough to appear discourteous. The tables had been arranged in a great horseshoe, with the king's chair at the head and places assigned according to rank and favor. Kaelen's position, earned through years of faithful service, placed him midway along the right side, close enough to hear important conversations, far enough from the center to avoid unwanted attention. The hall had been transformed for the occasion. Tapestries depicting the kingdom's greatest victories adorned the walls, while hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows that softened the harsh stone and made even the most weathered night appear younger. The aroma of roasted meat, fresh bread, and mulled wine filled the air, accompanied by the gentle melody of court musicians who had positioned themselves in the gallery above. Lady Serenya entered just after the first course had been served. And Kaelen felt the familiar stirring in his chest as she moved through the hall. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her auburn hair, now arranged in an elaborate style befitting a formal court occasion. The silver rose brooch remained at her throat, but tonight it seemed to glow with its own inner light, drawing the eye like a beacon in the candlelit hall. To his dismay, the empty seat directly across from his own had been reserved for her. Protocol demanded that he rise as she approached, along with the other knights at nearby tables. She acknowledged each man with a gracious nod before settling into her chair, her green eyes meeting his with what seemed like genuine pleasure. "Sir Kaelen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the small space between them. "I was hoping we might have an opportunity to speak properly. I fear our introduction the other evening was rather incomplete, my lady." His response came automatically, polished by years of court training. "I trust you have found your accommodations satisfactory, and the court to your liking?" "Both have exceeded my expectations," she replied, though there was something in her tone that suggested layers of meaning beneath the conventional words. "Though I confess I find the social customs here rather different from my homeland. In the border territories, we tend toward more direct conversation." The comment hung in the air between them like a gentle challenge. Around the table, other guests had begun their own conversations, creating a bubble of relative privacy despite the public setting. "Direct conversation can be refreshing," Kaelen admitted carefully, "though it sometimes comes at a cost in these more formal surroundings." "True enough." Lady Serenya lifted her goblet and took a delicate sip of wine, never taking her eyes from his face. "Though I found that the most interesting people are often those who have learned to navigate both directness and diplomacy, as circumstances require. Men of action who can also think carefully before they speak." The compliment, if that's what it was, caught him off guard. Most courtly ladies either ignored him entirely or offered the kind of nervous politeness reserved for potentially dangerous animals. Lady Serenya seemed entirely at ease in his presence, as if the whispered stories about his curse held no power over her. "You speak as someone with experience of such matters," he observed, surprising himself by continuing the conversation rather than deflecting it with some safe comment about the weather or the quality of the evening's entertainment. "I've had occasion to meet many different types of men," she replied with a slight smile that hinted at stories he suddenly found himself wanting to hear. "Warriors and scholars, merchants and nobles, farmers and craftsmen. Each has his own way of carrying himself, his own manner of revealing what truly matters to him." "And what do you believe matters to me?" The question escaped before he could stop it, emerging with more genuine curiosity than he had shown in any conversation for years. Lady Serenya considered him thoughtfully, her head tilted slightly as if studying a particularly interesting puzzle. "Honor, certainly. Duty, without question. But beneath those," she paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully, "I think you carry a great deal of pain, Sir Kaelen. The kind that comes from believing you failed someone important to you." The observation struck with the force of a physical blow. Kaelen's hand involuntarily moved toward the hidden locket at his chest before he caught himself and returned it to his goblet. Around them, the feast continued, but he felt as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them and her uncomfortably perceptive green eyes. "That's quite an assessment based on such brief acquaintance," he managed, his voice carefully controlled, despite the turmoil her words had awakened. "Perhaps. But I've found that some truths reveal themselves quickly to those who know what to look for." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice to ensure their conversation remained private. "I know something about carrying guilt, Sir Kaelen. About building walls to keep people away because you fear what might happen if you let them close." The words hung between them like a bridge he could either cross or burn. For 15 years, he had perfected the art of deflecting such personal observations with polite but firm redirections. Yet something in her tone, not pity or calculation, but genuine understanding, made his usual defenses feel suddenly inadequate. "The stories you may have heard," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue without revealing more than he intended. "I've heard whispers of a curse," she said quietly. "Tales of tragedy and magic, loss and self-imposed exile. But I've also seen how you carry yourself, watched how the other knights look to you for leadership, even as they maintain their distance. Whatever happened to you, it hasn't broken you. It's made you careful." Before he could respond, she did something that sent shock through every nerve in his body. With deliberate slowness, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his where it rested beside his goblet. The touch was light, barely more than a whisper of skin against skin, but it might as well have been lightning. For a moment, nothing happened. No supernatural wind howled through the hall, no candles flickered ominously, no flowers withered in their vases. There was only the warmth of her fingers against his, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, and the strange sensation of a 15-year-old weight beginning to shift on his shoulders. Then the curse stirred. It began as a subtle wrongness in the air around them, a barely perceptible chill that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The candles on their section of the table flickered, despite the absence of any breeze. A serving girl passing behind Lady Serenya stumbled slightly, her tray of goblets chiming with an oddly discordant note. Most disturbing of all, the roses adorning the table began to darken at their edges, their petals developing black spots that spread like ink through water. The transformation was gradual enough that most guests wouldn't notice immediately, but Kaelen saw it with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed such manifestations before. He jerked his hand away as if burned, the sudden movement sending wine sloshing from his goblet. "You shouldn't." He stopped, realizing that several nearby guests were beginning to take notice of the unusual atmospheric disturbances. "Forgive me, my lady. I fear I'm not well this evening." But instead of the fear or disgust he expected to see in her eyes, Lady Serenya simply looked intrigued. She glanced at the darkening roses, then back at his face, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "How fascinating," she murmured, her voice so low that only he could hear. "It responds to emotion, doesn't it? The stronger the feeling, the more pronounced the effect." Her clinical interest in phenomena that had terrified him for 15 years left Kaelen speechless. Before he could formulate a response, she rose gracefully from her seat, causing the gentlemen at nearby tables to scramble to their feet in belated courtesy. "I find myself rather fatigued from the evening's festivities," she announced to their section of the table. "If you'll excuse me, I believe I'll retire early." As she moved around the table toward the exit, she paused beside his chair just long enough to lean down and speak softly near his ear. "Meet me in the rose garden tomorrow at sunset, Sir Kaelen. I think it's time we had a truly direct conversation." The scent of her perfume, something subtle with notes of jasmine and cedar, lingered after she had gone, mixing strangely with the now obvious smell of dying flowers. Around the table, conversations resumed as guests attributed the minor disturbances to drafts or tricks of candlelight, but Kaelen remained frozen in his chair, staring at the spot where her hand had touched his. For the first time in 15 years, someone had witnessed a manifestation of his curse and reacted with curiosity, rather than horror. The implications of that reaction terrified him almost as much as Lady Serenya herself. This woman, who seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed defenses to the lonely man beneath. Kaelen spent the following day in a state of barely controlled agitation. His morning sword practice with the new recruits suffered from his distraction twice. He had to stop mid-demonstration when his mind wandered to green eyes and the impossible request for a meeting in the rose garden. The young man noticed his unusual lack of focus, exchanging worried glances when their famously precise instructor stumbled over basic forms he could normally execute while half-asleep by afternoon. He had resolved not to meet Lady Serenya. The decision sat uneasily in his chest, but logic demanded he maintain the distance that had protected him for 15 years. Whatever curiosity she felt about his curse would fade once she realized he had no intention of indulging it. Court ladies, no matter how intelligent or perceptive, eventually lost interest in puzzles that refused to be solved. Yet as sunset approached, he found himself walking toward the castle's rose garden, despite every rational argument against it. The garden occupied a secluded corner of the castle grounds, protected by high stone walls and accessible through a single wrought iron gate that the gardeners typically locked after their evening rounds. Someone had left it ajar tonight, whether by accident or design, he couldn't say. The roses themselves had passed their peak bloom with the coming of autumn, but enough flowers remained to perfume the air with their fading sweetness. Lady Serenya was already waiting when he arrived, seated on a marble bench beneath an arbor heavy with climbing vines. She had changed from her formal court attire into a simple gown of soft gray wool, her auburn hair braided loosely over one shoulder. The silver rose brooch still gleamed at her throat, catching the last rays of sunlight that filtered through the garden's canopy. "I wasn't certain you would come," she said without turning around, her voice carrying easily in the garden's hushed atmosphere. "Neither was I." The admission surprised him with its honesty. He remained standing near the gate, maintaining a careful distance between them. "My lady, about last evening. Please, call me Serenya." She turned to face him then, patting the bench beside her in an invitation he made no move to accept. "And there's no need to apologize for what happened." It was illuminating, actually. Illuminating. It couldn't keep the bitter edge from his voice. An interesting word choice for something most would consider cursed or unnatural. "Most people fear what they don't understand," she replied calmly. "I found that fear blinds us to possibilities we might otherwise explore." Her matter-of-fact tone regarding the supernatural events of the previous evening only deepened his confusion. In 15 years, no one had spoken of his curse with such casual acceptance, not even Aldrich, who had witnessed its effects firsthand on multiple occasions. "You speak as if you have experience with such things," he observed, finally taking a few steps closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. "More than you might expect." Serenya rose from the bench and moved toward a section of the garden where late-blooming roses still displayed their colors proudly. "The border territories are wild places, Sir Kaelen. Magic there is less carefully contained than it is here in the heart of the kingdom. I've seen curses and blessings, healings and hauntings, enough to know that the line between natural and supernatural is far thinner than most people believe." She paused beside a bush heavy with deep red blooms, their petals almost black in the fading light. "I've also learned to recognize the difference between magic imposed from without and magic that grows from within. Your curse, whatever its origin, has become part of you after all these years. It responds to your emotions because it feeds on them." The observation struck uncomfortably close to conclusions he had begun to reach himself during long, sleepless nights of self-examination. "Even if that were true," he said carefully, "it changes nothing. The danger remains real, regardless of its source, does it?" She turned back to face him, her green eyes holding a challenge he couldn't quite decipher. "When did you last test the limits of this supposed curse? When did you last allow yourself to truly care for someone enough to discover what might happen?" The question hit like a physical blow. "I won't risk another person's life to satisfy curiosity about theoretical possibilities," he said firmly. "I've seen what happens when I allow myself to—" He stopped, unwilling to complete the thought. "To feel?" she finished gently. "To hope? To live as something more than a cautious shadow of the man you might have been. Her words carried no judgment, only a sadness that seemed to echo his own carefully hidden grief. For the first time since entering the garden, he allowed himself to really look at her, not just her physical beauty, which was considerable, but the depth of understanding in her eyes and the way she held herself with the quiet strength of someone who had faced her own demons and survived. "You don't know what you're asking," he said quietly. "Don't I?" She moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes and count the faint freckles across the bridge of her nose. "I know what it means to build walls around your heart to protect others from the consequences of caring for you. I know the weight of believing yourself responsible for tragedies you were powerless to prevent." Something in her tone suggested she spoke from personal experience rather than mere sympathy. "What happened to you?" he asked, the question emerging without conscious thought. For a moment, her composed facade cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of old pain carefully controlled but never fully healed. "Perhaps that's a story for another evening," she said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Tonight I'm more interested in your story, Kaelen. The real story, not the whispered fragments that circulate through the court." The use of his name without title created an intimacy that both thrilled and terrified him. No woman had spoken his name with such gentle familiarity since Liana, and hearing it from Serenya's lips awakened longings he had thought permanently buried. "Why?" The word emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Why does it matter to you?" She was close enough now that he could have reached out and touched her face if he dared. Instead, he kept his hands carefully at his sides, even as every instinct urged him toward the connection she offered. "Because I see who you really are beneath all that careful control," she replied softly. "I see a man who has spent 15 years punishing himself for crimes he committed only in his own mind. A man who has convinced himself that isolation equals safety, when all it really equals is a slow death of the spirit." Her words struck at the heart of fears he had never dared voice even to himself. "And if you're wrong?" he asked. "If the curse is real and caring for you brings you only harm, then at least one of us will have truly lived before the end." The simple statement carried a courage that left him breathless. "But I don't think I'm wrong, Kaelen. I think you've been carrying a burden that was never yours to bear, and it's time someone helped you set it down." The sun had set completely while they talked, leaving the garden bathed in the soft silver light of a rising moon. In that gentle illumination, Serenya looked almost ethereal, like some fairy tale princess come to offer salvation to a cursed knight. But there was nothing ethereal about the warmth in her eyes or the very real courage required to stand so close to a man whom everyone else treated as potentially dangerous. "I should go," he said, though his feet made no move toward the gate. "Should you?" She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made his heart skip several beats. "Or should you stay and tell me about the girl whose memory you carry in that locket at your chest?" His hand moved involuntarily toward the hidden pendant before he could stop himself, confirming her perceptive guess. How had she known? How had she seen through defenses that had fooled everyone else for 15 years? Her name was Liana, he heard himself say, and knew that whatever happened next, his carefully constructed walls had already begun to crumble. The confession seemed to unlock something in Kaelen's chest that had been sealed for 15 years. Standing in the moonlit garden with Serenya's understanding eyes upon him, he found himself speaking of memories he had shared with no one, not even Aldrich, who knew the basic facts but had never heard the deeper truths. She was the baker's daughter in Millbrook, he continued, his voice growing stronger as the words found their rhythm. Golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, and a laugh that could make even the grumpiest old merchant smile. "We grew up together. She was barely a year younger than I, and everyone in the village assumed we would marry someday." Serenya had returned to the marble bench but she patted the space beside her again, and this time he found himself accepting the invitation. He sat carefully, maintaining a small distance between them, while his hands worked nervously at the leather of his sword belt. "She sounds lovely," Serenya said gently, her tone holding no jealousy or competition, only genuine interest in understanding the forces that had shaped him. "She was everything bright and good in my world," he replied, pulling the locket free from beneath his shirt. The small silver pendant caught the moonlight, its surface worn smooth by years of unconscious touching. "When the raiders came that night, I thought I was strong enough to protect her. I was already taller than most of the men in the village, had been training with the local militia for 2 years. In my 15-year-old arrogance, I believed my sword arm could overcome any threat." He opened the locket with careful fingers, revealing the miniature portrait within. Even in the dim light, Liana's painted features seemed to glow with life and joy captured forever at the moment of her greatest happiness. Unaware of the tragedy that would claim her just days later, Serenya leaned closer to examine the portrait, her shoulder brushing against his as she studied the delicate brushwork. The brief contact sent warmth spreading through him, accompanied by the familiar stirring of supernatural energy that marked the curse's presence. But no candles flickered here in the garden, no roses withered at their approach. Perhaps the open air diluted the effect, or perhaps the curse required stronger emotions to manifest fully. "She was indeed beautiful," Serenya said softly. "But more than that, she looks happy, truly, deeply happy. That's rarer than mere beauty." "She was planning our wedding when she died," Kaelen continued, his voice growing thick with old grief. "Her father had finally given his blessing, and she spent every free moment embroidering linens for our future home. She had such dreams, a garden full of herbs for cooking and healing, children to fill the house with laughter, chickens in the yard, and maybe a milk cow if we prospered." The memory brought both comfort and pain, as it always did. Those simple dreams, once shared with such innocent confidence, seemed like treasures beyond price, now that he understood how fragile happiness could be. "What happened that night?" Serenya asked gently. "The real story, not the version filtered through court gossip." Kaelen was quiet for a long moment, gathering courage to speak aloud the details he had replayed countless times in his private torment. "The harvest festival was nearly over when they struck foreign soldiers under a banner none of us recognized. They moved through the village like a scythe through wheat, burning and killing with systematic efficiency. But it wasn't simple raiding. They were searching for something." He closed the locket but kept it in his palm, drawing strength from its familiar weight. "Their leader was a sorcerer, ancient and terrible, who spoke our language with an accent I couldn't place. He interrogated the village elders, demanding to know the location of some artifact or relic. When they couldn't provide answers, he began killing people one by one, starting with the youngest children." Serenya's hand found his free one, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture of comfort and support. This time, he didn't pull away, though he could feel the curse's energy building like storm clouds on the horizon. "I tried to fight them," he continued. "Liana and I had taken shelter with several other families in the temple. We thought the sacred ground might protect us. When the soldiers broke down the doors, I stepped forward with my father's sword, shouting challenges like some hero from the old stories. The sorcerer looked at me and laughed. The memory of that laughter still had the power to chill his blood. It had been the sound of someone who found mortal struggles amusing, but ultimately insignificant. He struck me down with a gesture, some spell that felt like lightning in my veins. While I lay paralyzed, unable to even cry out, he killed Liana, slowly, deliberately, making sure I watched every moment. Then he placed his hand on my forehead and spoke the curse, that any woman I loved would suffer the same fate, that I would carry the responsibility for their deaths as I carried the responsibility for hers. Serenya's grip on his hand tightened, anchoring him to the present as the old trauma threatened to pull him back into that terrible night. But you weren't responsible for her death, she said firmly. You were 15 years old, facing trained soldiers and dark magic. No one could have asked more of you than what you gave. I've told myself that countless times, he replied with weary honesty. Sir Aldrich found me 3 days later, half mad with grief and guilt, and he spent 15 years trying to convince me of the same truth. But knowing something intellectually and believing it in your heart are different things entirely. And the curse? She pressed gently. Have there been other incidents over the years? He nodded reluctantly. 3 times, I allowed myself to feel something approaching affection for a woman. Each time, accidents befell them. A serving girl fell downstairs and broke her neck. A merchant's daughter took fever and died despite the healer's best efforts. A young widow was thrown from her horse and killed instantly. Each death felt like confirmation of the sorcerer's words. Accidents, Serenya repeated thoughtfully. Not supernatural attacks or obvious magical interference. Just ordinary misfortunes that could have happened to anyone. The pattern was too clear to be coincidence, he insisted, though he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his own voice as he spoke the words aloud. Was it? She turned to face him more fully, her green eyes reflecting moonlight like still water. Or did you look for connections because you expected to find them? Did you perhaps withdraw your affection at the first sign of trouble, leaving these women to face their difficulties alone when they might have benefited from your support? The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. He had indeed pulled away from each woman at the first hint of misfortune, convincing himself that distance would protect them. But what if his abandonment had actually made their situations worse? What if his absence had removed a source of strength and comfort when they needed it most? I never considered, he began, then stopped, his entire worldview tilting on its axis. You were trying to protect them, Serenya said with gentle understanding. I don't fault you for that impulse. But perhaps true protection lies not in distance, but in presence. Perhaps love's power to heal outweighs whatever curse might threaten to harm. Before he could respond to that revolutionary thought, a new voice cut through the garden's peaceful atmosphere like a blade through silk. How touching. The cursed knight and the naive lady, sharing secrets in the moonlight. They turned to find Sir Brennan standing in the garden's entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the torchlight from the castle courtyard beyond. Even in shadow, his sneer was visible, and the malice in his voice made Kaelen's hand move instinctively toward his sword hilt. Sir Brennan had arrived at Ravenshollow 2 years earlier, a landless knight seeking service with the King's Guard. He possessed undeniable skill with weapons and had proven competent in several small campaigns. But there was something cold and calculating in his pale blue eyes that had always made Kaelen uncomfortable. The man seemed to take particular pleasure in others' misfortunes, and his comments often carried barbs designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Sir Brennan, Kaelen said carefully, rising from the bench and positioning himself slightly in front of Serenya. The garden is open to all, though most prefer to announce their presence rather than lurk in shadows. I wasn't lurking, Brennan replied with false joviality, stepping fully into the garden. His hand rested casually on his sword pommel, not an overt threat, but a reminder of his readiness for violence. I was simply enjoying an evening walk when I heard voices. Imagine my surprise to discover our resident hermit entertaining a lady, with tales of his tragic past. Lower your voice, Serenya said quietly, but there was steel beneath her calm tone. This is neither the time nor place for whatever grievance you believe you're nursing. Brennan's attention fixed on her with predatory intensity. Ah, the lady speaks for herself. How refreshing. Tell me, Lady Serenya, has our brooding knight warned you about the fate that befalls women who grow too close to him? Or perhaps you believe yourself different from those who came before. Kaelen felt the curse stirring in response to his rising anger and protective instincts. Around them, The garden's remaining roses began to darken at their edges, their petals developing the black spots that marked the supernatural energy's manifestation. A chill wind rose from nowhere, setting the arbor's vines to rustling despite the stillness of the night beyond. "That's enough," Kaelen said, his voice carrying the authority of years of battlefield command. "Whatever you hope to accomplish here, you've made your point. Now withdraw before this escalates beyond words." But Brennan seemed energized by the supernatural display, his eyes brightening with malicious pleasure. "There it is," he said with satisfaction. "The famous curse reveals itself. Tell me, my lady, does it not give you pause to see how darkness follows in his wake? How even the flowers wither at his emotional disturbance?" Serenya rose gracefully from the bench, a silver rose brooch catching the moonlight as she moved, to stand beside Kaelen rather than behind him. "The only darkness I see here," she said with cutting clarity, "is the petty jealousy of a small man who cannot bear to witness genuine connection between others." The insult struck home with devastating accuracy. Brennan's face flushed red even in the dim light, his hand tightening on his sword hilt until his knuckles showed white. "You presume much for a woman who has known him barely a week," he snarled. "Perhaps you need a demonstration of what his affection truly costs." The threat hung in the air between them like drawn steel. Kaelen felt his own anger building to dangerous levels, the curse responding with increasing intensity. More roses began to blacken and wither, their dying petals falling like dark snow around the three figures locked in their tense confrontation. "Be very careful with your next words," Kaelen warned, his voice dropping to the tone he used before battle. "I have little patience for men who threaten ladies under the protection of this court." "Protection?" Brennan laughed harshly. "From the man whose very presence brings death? She would be safer sharing a bed with a viper." That final insult shattered the last of Kaelen's restraint. He took a step forward, his hand moving to his sword hilt, but Serenya's voice stopped him cold. "Enough," she commanded, her tone carrying such authority that both men froze mid-motion. "Sir Brennan, you will withdraw immediately, or I will personally ensure that the king hears how you use threats and intimidation to harass his guests in what should be a sanctuary of peace." For a moment, Brennan looked ready to escalate the confrontation into actual violence. But whatever he saw in Serenya's eyes, or perhaps the realization that attacking a guest under the king's protection would mean death or exile, made him reconsider. With visible effort, he loosened his grip on his sword and stepped back. "This isn't finished," he said, his voice carrying the promise of future trouble. "Some lessons can only be learned through bitter experience." He turned and strode from the Philbin's garden, leaving Kaelen and Serenya alone among the withered roses and the lingering scent of supernatural wrongness. The curse's energy gradually dissipated, but the damage to the garden remained as a stark reminder of what had transpired. "I'm sorry," Kaelen said quietly, surveying the blackened flowers with familiar self-recrimination. "This is exactly why I maintain my distance from others. My emotions, my anger, they bring destruction to everything around me." But Serenya surprised him by laughing, a sound like silver bells that seemed to cleanse the air of its remaining darkness. "Is that what you see here?" she asked, gesturing at the damaged roses. "Destruction? What else would you call it?" "Proof," she replied firmly, "that you care enough about someone's well-being to risk revealing your vulnerability. You didn't withdraw or flee when threatened. You stood your ground to protect me. Curse be damned. That's not the action of a man enslaved by dark magic. It's the action of a man whose heart still knows how to love, despite 15 years of trying to convince himself otherwise." The days following the garden confrontation passed in a haze of confusion and growing tension. Word of the incident had spread through the castle's gossip networks with typical efficiency. though the details grew more distorted with each telling. Some versions cast Sir Brennan as a hero attempting to save Lady Serenya from Kaelen's supernatural influence. Others painted him as a jealous fool who had overstepped his bounds and faced divine retribution in the form of withering roses. Kaelen found himself the subject of more attention than he had endured in years. Servants crossed themselves when he passed. Fellow knights offered carefully neutral greetings that suggested uncertainty about his true nature, and courtiers whispered behind their hands with renewed fascination about the curse that followed him like a shadow. Through it all, Serenya seemed completely unaffected by the supernatural drama swirling around them. She attended court functions with her usual grace, participated in conversations with apparent ease, and showed no signs of fear or regret about her association with him. If anything, she seemed more determined than ever to seek out his company, appearing wherever he happened to be with coincidental frequency that couldn't actually be coincidental. Her persistence both thrilled and terrified him. Each encounter chipped away at defenses he had spent 15 years perfecting, leaving him increasingly vulnerable to feelings he had sworn never to experience again. The moonstone pendant she wore seemed to grow brighter in his presence, its pale luminescence visible even through the fabric of her gowns, a phenomenon that several court ladies had begun to comment upon with mixtures of envy and unease. On the 5th day after their garden meeting, she approached him in the castle's library, a vast, dim space filled with ancient tomes and scrolls that served as his refuge when social obligations became overwhelming. He had been researching military tactics for an upcoming campaign when her familiar scent of jasmine and cedar announced her presence before she spoke. "Good morning, Sir Kaelen," she said, settling into the chair across from his reading table without waiting for an invitation. "I trust you've been well since our last conversation?" He looked up from the manuscript he'd been studying to find, her watching him with that same mixture of warmth and challenge that never failed to send his pulse racing. Today she wore a gown of deep blue wool that complemented her auburn hair, and the silver rose brooch at her throat seemed to echo the brightness of her eyes. "Well enough," he replied carefully, marking his place in the text before giving her his full attention. "Though I confess I'm surprised to find you seeking my company so openly, given the whispers that have been circulating. Court gossip has never held much power over my decisions," she said with a slight smile. "I'm more interested in forming my own opinions based on direct experience." "And what has that experience taught you so far?" The question emerged despite his better judgment, driven by a curiosity he couldn't quite suppress. "That you're far more interesting than the brooding hermit you pretend to be," she replied without hesitation. "That your supposed curse responds more to your emotional state than to any external magical influence, and that you're desperately lonely despite your best efforts to convince yourself otherwise." Each observation struck with uncomfortable accuracy. "You seem quite certain of your conclusions." "I am." She leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more serious. "I've also reached some conclusions about Sir Brennan and his motivations that I think you should hear." The change in topic surprised him. "What do you mean?" "I've been making inquiries about his background discreetly, of course. The story he tells about his origins doesn't quite match the records I've been able to uncover." She glanced around the library to ensure they remained alone before continuing, in a lower voice. "He claims to have served with the border guards in the Eastern Territories, but the commanders there have no record of anyone by his name or description." A chill of unease ran down Kaelen's spine. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not entirely certain yet," she admitted. "But his interest in both of us seems more calculated than simple jealousy would explain. The way he spoke about your curse that night, he seemed to know details that aren't part of the general court gossip." The observation troubled Kaelen more than he cared to admit. Brennan's knowledge of his history had indeed seemed unusually specific, and his timing in appearing at the garden had been suspiciously convenient. "Perhaps I should speak with Sir Aldrich about this," he said thoughtfully. "He has connections throughout the kingdom that might help verify or disprove Brennan's claims." "That would be wise." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, the gesture so natural it seemed to surprise them both. This time, the curse's response was barely noticeable, just a slight chill in the air and a faint flickering of the nearby candles. "But there's something else I wanted to discuss with you, something more personal." Her touch sent warmth spreading up his arm, accompanied by a complex mixture of hope and terror that made coherent thought difficult. "What is it?" "I've been researching your curse," she said simply. "Not just listening to stories and rumors, but conducting actual research into the magical traditions that might have created it." The statement struck him speechless. "You've been what?" "The castle's library contains more than just military histories and courtly romances," she explained, gesturing at the shelves towering around them. "There are grimoires, treatises on magical theory, accounts of curses and their remedies collected from across the known world. I've spent the past several nights reading everything I could find on the subject." "That's dangerous," he said automatically. "Some of those texts are restricted for good reason. The knowledge they contain is exactly what we need to understand what was done to you 15 years ago." Her interruption carried gentle firmness. "Kaelen, I don't believe your curse is what you think it is. I don't believe it's what the sorcerer told you it was either." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything he had accepted as truth for half his lifetime. "What do you mean?" "I mean that true magical curses, the kind that bind supernatural consequences to emotional states, require specific conditions to maintain their power. They need anchoring objects, regular renewal through ritual, or connection to ley lines of magical energy. Your curse shows none of these characteristics." She pulled a slim volume from beneath her cloak and placed it on the table between them. The leather binding was dark with age, its title embossed in silver lettering that seemed to shift in the candlelight. "Phenomena of grief and trauma in magical manifestations." "According to this text," she continued, "what you describe sounds more like spontaneous psychic manifestation triggered by extreme emotional trauma. The supernatural effects aren't imposed from outside. They're generated by your own unconscious mind, fed by guilt and reinforced by expectation." Kaelen stared at the book as if it were a viper coiled to strike. "You're suggesting the curse isn't real?" "I'm suggesting it's not the kind of curse you believe it to be." Her voice carried infinite patience, as if she were explaining complex concepts to someone struggling to grasp their implications. "The effects are real. We've both witnessed them. But their source might be internal rather than external. Which means they might be controllable," he finished, his mind racing to process the implications. "If the power comes from within, then theoretically, you might be able to learn to control or even dismiss it entirely." Her smile brightened the dim library like sunrise after a long night. "But it would require you to confront the guilt and trauma that originally gave it birth. It would mean accepting that Liana's death wasn't your fault, that the subsequent accidents weren't divine punishment for daring to care again." The prospect both thrilled and terrified him. After 15 years of living with the certainty of his cursed state, the possibility of freedom seemed too wonderful to believe and too dangerous to hope for. "And if you're wrong?" he asked quietly. "If the curse is exactly what I've always believed it to be, and attempting to control it only makes it stronger, then we face whatever comes together," she replied without hesitation. "But I don't think I'm wrong, Kaelen. I think you've been carrying a burden that was never truly yours to bear, and it's past time someone helped you set it down." The simple declaration of partnership sent warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with supernatural forces and everything to do with the revolutionary concept of not facing his demons alone. For the first time in 15 years, he dared to imagine what life might be like without the constant weight of guilt and fear. Outside the library's tall windows, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising weather as turbulent as the emotions building in his chest. But here in this quiet sanctuary, with Serenya's hand warm over his and ancient wisdom spread before them, Kaelen felt something he had almost forgotten how to experience: hope, the storm that had threatened all. Morning finally broke just as Kaelen was finishing his afternoon weapon drills with the castle guard. Rain lashed the practice yard in sheets, sending the younger knight scrambling for shelter while he methodically cleaned and sheathed his sword despite the downpour. Water ran from his hair and soaked through his training leathers, but he welcomed the physical discomfort as a distraction from the emotional turbulence that had plagued him since his library conversation with Serenya. Her theory about his curse consumed his thoughts with relentless persistence. If she was right, if the supernatural manifestations truly originated from his own traumatized psyche rather than external magical forces, then everything he had believed about himself and his limitations was wrong. The possibility offered hope beyond his wildest dreams, but it also demanded a fundamental reshaping of his entire worldview. Sir Aldrich found him there in the empty practice yard, standing motionless in the rain, like some statue commemorating a forgotten battle. The older knight approached with the measured gait of someone accustomed to weathering storms both literal and metaphorical, his gray cloak already dark with moisture. "Planning to drown yourself in stages?" Aldrich asked with the dry humor that had sustained their friendship through 2 decades of military service. "Or are you attempting some new form of meditation that requires complete saturation?" "I was thinking," Kaelen replied, finally turning away from his contemplation of the weapon racks, "about curses and guilt, trauma and truth. About whether a man can be his own worst enemy without realizing it." Aldrich's weathered face grew more serious. "Ah, I take it Lady Serenya has been sharing her research with you." The comment caught Kaelen off guard. "You know about her investigations? My boy, I've been watching over you for 15 years. Did you think I wouldn't notice when an intelligent woman began asking pointed questions about magical theory in the castle library?" Aldrich gestured toward the armory. "Come, this conversation requires warmth and privacy, neither of which the practice yard can provide." They made their way through rain-slicked corridors to Aldrich's private chambers, a spartanly furnished room that reflected its occupant's practical nature. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with weapons collected from a lifetime of campaigns. Aldrich poured mulled wine into 2 goblets, while Kaelen shed his soaked outer garments and accepted the chair closest to the flames. "Now then," Aldrich said, settling into his own chair with a grunt that spoke of old injuries and advancing years. "What specifically has our perceptive lady discovered that has you looking like a man who's seen ghosts?" Kaelen stared into the wine's dark surface, watching steam rise from its heated depths. "She believes the curse isn't what I think it is, that the supernatural effects I've witnessed for 15 years originate from my own guilt and trauma rather than the sorcerer's magic." "And what do you believe?" Aldrich asked quietly. "I don't know what to believe anymore." The admission tasted bitter as the wine was sweet. "If she's right, it means I've spent 15 years in self-imposed exile for nothing. It means Liana's death wasn't my fault, that the women who died afterward weren't victims of my cursed affection. It would also mean," Aldrich observed carefully, "that you have the power to change your circumstances. That freedom is possible if you can find the courage to claim it." Kaelen looked up sharply. "You agree with her theory?" The older knight was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking wisdom in its shifting patterns. "I've had my suspicions for years," he finally said. "The timing of the supernatural manifestations always seemed too closely tied to your emotional state to be coincidental. True magical curses typically operate with more consistent, predictable effects. Then why didn't you say something? The question emerged with more heat than Kaelen intended. Why let me suffer in isolation if you suspected the truth? Because suspicion isn't certainty, and you weren't ready to hear such theories until now. Aldrich's voice carried the patience of someone who had learned hard lessons about timing and readiness. You needed to arrive at this possibility yourself, or with the help of someone whose opinion you valued more than mine. The gentle reproach struck home. Kaelen realized with uncomfortable clarity that he would have dismissed such suggestions from Aldrich as wishful thinking or misguided compassion. But hearing the same theories from Serenya, a woman whose intelligence and courage had already earned his deep respect, made them impossible to ignore. "There's something else troubling you," Aldrich observed. "I can see it in your posture, the way you're gripping that goblet. What haven't you told me?" Kaelen hesitated, then decided that full honesty was the only way forward. Serenya has been investigating Sir Brennan's background. She believes his story about his origins doesn't match the official records. Aldrich's expression grew grim. What has she discovered? Inconsistencies. Claims of service that can't be verified. Knowledge of my history that seems too detailed. For casual court gossip, Kaelen leaned forward intently. She thinks his interest in both of us is more calculated than simple jealousy would explain. Troubling, if true. Aldrich rose and moved to a wooden chest near the window, withdrawing a leather portfolio thick with documents. As it happens, I've been conducting some inquiries of my own since that incident in the garden. Sir Brennan's arrival at court, too, years ago struck me as convenient, given the timing of certain other events. He returned to his chair and spread several parchments on the small table between them. Maps, correspondence, and what appeared to be military reports created a pattern of information that Kaelen couldn't immediately decipher. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "Evidence that Sir Brennan may not be who he claims to be." Aldrich pointed to a particular document. "This is a report from the Eastern Border Guards, dated 6 months before Brennan's arrival here. It describes a raid by the same foreign force that destroyed your village 15 years ago. The first confirmed sighting of that particular group since the night Lyanna died. Ice formed in Kaelen's veins. You think there's a connection? I think the timing is suspicious enough to warrant investigation." Aldrich's finger moved to another document. "This is a description of one of the raiders who escaped that border skirmish. The physical details match Sir Brennan remarkably well. The implications hit Kaelen like a physical blow. If Brennan was connected to the raiders who had destroyed his village, if he was perhaps even one of the soldiers who had served the sorcerer that terrible night, then his presence at Ravenshollow represented something far more dangerous than simple romantic rivalry." "But why would he come here?" Kaelen asked, his mind racing. What could he hope to accomplish after 15 years? Perhaps the sorcerer's curse required more than a single casting to maintain its power, Aldrich suggested grimly. Perhaps Brennan was sent to ensure it remained in effect, to prevent you from ever breaking free of the guilt and isolation it created. The theory sent chills through Kaelen that had nothing to do with his rain-soaked clothing. If Brennan was indeed an agent of the original curse, then his attempts to drive a wedge between Kaelen and Serenya took on sinister new meaning. The confrontation in the garden hadn't been about jealousy. It had been about maintaining the psychological chains that kept Kaelen isolated and powerless. "We need to warn Serenya," he said, rising abruptly from his chair. "If I'm right about Brennan's intentions, she may be in danger simply for helping me question the curse's nature." Agreed. Aldrich began gathering the documents. "But we must be careful how we proceed. If Brennan suspects we're investigating him, he may accelerate whatever plans he's been developing." Thunder crashed overhead, emphasizing the gravity of their situation. The storm that had begun as mere weather now seemed like an omen of conflicts to come. Somewhere in the castle, Serenya was continuing her research, unaware that her efforts to free Kaelen from his supposed curse might have painted a target on her back. "There's something else," Kaelen said as they prepared to leave Aldrich's chambers. "Something I need to tell you about what's been happening between Serenya and myself." Aldrich paused in securing his documents. "What do you mean?" "The curse's effects have been growing weaker in her presence. When we touch, when we're close together, the supernatural manifestations are less pronounced than they've ever been." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown depths. It's as if her proximity somehow dampens the power that drives the phenomena. A slow smile spread across Aldrich's weathered features. "Now that," he said with satisfaction, "sounds very much like what one would expect if a curse were being weakened by genuine love and acceptance rather than strengthened by fear and isolation." The word love hung in the air between them like a banner raised before battle. Kaelen hadn't dared use that term, even in his private thoughts, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone whose judgment he trusted made it impossible to deny the depth of his feelings for Serenya. "Then you believe she's right?" he asked. "That the curse can be broken?" "I believe," Aldrich said firmly, "that you've spent 15 years punishing yourself for crimes you never committed. And I believe that Lady Serenya may be exactly what you need to finally set that burden down." Outside, lightning illuminated the castle walls in stark relief, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of Raven's Hollow. But inside Aldrich's chamber, despite the revelations about Brennan and the dangers that might lie ahead, Kaelen felt something he hadn't experienced since that terrible night in Millbrook. The genuine possibility of redemption. The ancient tome Serenya had discovered in the library's restricted section proved to contain more revelations than either of them had anticipated. 3 nights after the storm, she appeared at Kaelen's chamber door well past midnight, her face pale with excitement and her arms laden with books and scrolls that rustled with age. "I found it," she whispered urgently, glancing down the corridor, "to ensure they weren't observed. The original record of your curse, not the stories or legends, but the actual magical working that was performed." Kaelen stepped aside to let her enter, his heart racing at both her proximity and the implications of her words. His chambers were spartanly furnished but warm, a fire burning low in the hearth and candles providing gentle illumination. She spread her materials on his reading table with the careful precision of a scholar arranging sacred texts. "This grimoire belonged to a court wizard from 2 centuries ago," she explained, opening a volume bound in midnight blue leather and secured with silver clasps. "He made detailed studies of foreign magical traditions, including the practices of the northern mountain tribes that produced your sorcerer." The pages were filled with intricate diagrams, symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight, and text written in multiple languages. But it was the illustration on the page she indicated that made Kaelen's breath catch in his throat, a perfect rendering of the crystal orb the sorcerer had carried that terrible night, surrounded by notes in a careful scholarly hand. "According to this," Serenya continued, her finger tracing the relevant passages, "the orb was called a vessel of sorrow. It was designed to contain and amplify emotional trauma, turning the victim's own guilt and grief into a self-sustaining prison of isolation." "I don't understand," Kaelen said, though a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in his mind. "The curse wasn't imposed on you from outside," she explained with growing excitement. "It was created from your own emotional response to Liana's death. The sorcerer used the orb to capture your guilt, your self-blame, your desperate wish that you could have saved her, and then he reflected those feelings back at you, magnified and distorted until they became a supernatural force in their own." "Right." The revelation struck him like a physical blow. "You're saying the curse is built from my own emotions?" "More than that." Her green eyes blazed with the intensity of discovery. "According to this text, The curse feeds on your continued belief in your own guilt. Every time you blame yourself for Liana's death, every time you withdraw from human connection out of fear, you strengthen the magical bonds that keep you isolated. Kaelen sank into a chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him as the full implications crashed over him like a collapsing wall. Then the women who died, the accidents that befell them, or likely natural misfortunes that you interpreted as supernatural punishment because you expected to find such patterns. Serenya moved to kneel beside his chair, her hands covering his where they gripped the armrests. The curse created a lens through which you viewed the world, one that transformed coincidence into confirmation of your worst fears. But the manifestations, he protested weakly, the withering flowers, the flickering candles, you've seen them yourself. I have, she agreed, and they're real. But look at this passage here. She reached for another book, one filled with diagrams of human anatomy overlaid with mystical symbols. Emotional trauma can manifest as psychic energy, especially in individuals who have been exposed to powerful magic. Your guilt creates genuine supernatural effects, but they're powered by your own mind, not by external forces. The words seemed to echo in the chamber's quiet air, reshaping everything he thought he knew about himself and his history. If she was right, if the curse truly originated from within his own traumatized psyche, then he had been both prisoner and jailer for 15 years. This changes nothing, he said desperately, clinging to the familiar certainty of his limitations. Even if the source is internal, the effects remain dangerous. I've seen what happens when I allow myself to care. Have you? She interrupted gently. Or have you seen what happens when you expect disaster and withdraw at the first sign? Trouble? When you abandon people who might benefit from your support because you're too afraid to risk genuine connection. The question pierced straight to the heart of his deepest fears. In all his years of careful isolation, he had never allowed any relationship to progress far enough to truly test the curse's limits. At the first hint of misfortune, a stumble, a cough, a moment's sadness, he had retreated, leaving the other person to face their difficulties alone. What if I tried to stay close and something terrible happened? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if you tried to stay close and something wonderful happened? She countered, her hands tightening over his. What if love proves stronger than fear? What if 15 years of isolation has been the real curse, and connection is actually the cure? Before he could respond, a soft sound from the chamber's window drew their attention. A crystal orb, dark and pulsing with malevolent energy, rolled across the floor toward them as if drawn by invisible hands. The very air around it seemed to thicken and grow cold, and Kaelen recognized it immediately, despite the 15 years that had passed since their last encounter. The vessel of sorrow, Serenya breathed, rising quickly to her feet. But how? I brought it, said a familiar voice from the doorway. Sir Brennan stepped into the chamber, his usual mask of civility replaced by something cold and calculating. In his hand, he carried a blade that gleamed with the same dark energy as the orb, and his pale eyes held the fanatic intensity of someone pursuing a long-cherished goal. Surprised to see me? He continued, closing the door behind him with deliberate calm. You shouldn't be. I've been waiting 15 years for this moment, waiting for you to finally begin questioning the curse that has kept you exactly where we needed you. We? Kaelen rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his sword before he remembered it wasn't at his side. The Order of Eternal Sorrow, Brennan replied with pride. Servants of the great sorcerer whose work you've been carrying forward all these years, though you never realized it. Your isolation, your guilt, your refusal to form meaningful connections, all of it has been feeding power back to the source, strengthening the network of despair that spans across kingdoms. The revelation struck Kaelen like ice water. You're saying my curse wasn't just personal revenge. It was part of something larger, much larger. Brennan's smile held no warmth, only the satisfaction of a predator finally revealing itself to corner prey. The sorcerer who destroyed your village was creating vessels of concentrated sorrow across the continent. Each person cursed becomes a node in a web of despair, their emotional suffering channeled to fuel greater workings of dark magic. Serenya stepped protectively closer to Kaelen, her hand moving to the silver rose brooch at her throat. And you've been maintaining the curse all these years, making sure he never broke free of its influence. Precisely. Brennan's attention fixed on her with predatory interest. Though I must admit, your interference has been more troublesome than anticipated. The research you've been conducting, the hope you've been instilling, it's begun to weaken. The bonds that hold him. The crystal orb pulsed more brightly, its dark energy seeming to reach toward Kaelen like grasping fingers. He could feel the familiar chill of supernatural force. But this time, he also sensed something else. The artificial nature of the compulsion, the way it tried to magnify his guilt and despair beyond their natural proportions. You felt it too, didn't you? Serenya said quietly, her eyes still fixed on Brennan, but her words meant for Kaelen. When you looked at the orb just now, you could sense the difference between its manufactured despair and your genuine emotions. She was right. The curse's influence felt hollow now, like an echo of real feeling rather than true emotion. The guilt and self-blame that had defined him for 15 years seemed suddenly foreign, imposed rather than organic. The lady is perceptive, Brennan acknowledged with false admiration, which is precisely why she cannot be allowed to continue her interference. The orb requires fresh sorrow to maintain its power, and her death, particularly if you believe yourself responsible for it, should provide enough fuel to reinforce your bonds for another decade or two. The threat to Serenya ignited something fierce and protective in Kaelen's chest. The curse tried to respond to his rising emotions, attempting to channel his anger into the familiar patterns of self-destructive despair. But now that he understood its artificial nature, he found he could resist its pull. You made one crucial error, he said, surprising Brennan with the steady confidence in his voice. You assumed that knowing the truth about the curse would make me more vulnerable to manipulation. Instead, it's shown me exactly where my real power lies. And where is that? Brennan sneered, raising his enchanted blade. In choosing love over fear, Kaelen replied, reaching for Serenya's hand. In accepting connection, despite the risks. In refusing to let artificial guilt override genuine courage. The moment their fingers intertwined, the chamber filled with warm, clear light that seemed to emanate from Serenya's moonstone pendant. The crystal orb's dark pulsing faltered, its malevolent energy wavering like a candle in a strong wind. Impossible. Brennan snarled, his confidence cracking for the first time. The vessel should be feeding on your emotional connection. Growing stronger. It would be, Serenya interrupted, her voice carrying newfound authority, if that connection were based on need or desperation. But what exists between us isn't. The desperate clinging the curse was designed to exploit. It's freely chosen partnership between equals. The light from her pendant grew brighter, and Kaelen realized with wonder that the curse's supernatural manifestations were reversing themselves. Instead of withering flowers and flickering candles, he could sense life and warmth flowing outward from their joined hands. The curse feeds on isolation and self-blame, he said, understanding flooding through him like sunrise after the longest night. But love freely given and freely received starves it of power. Brennan's face twisted with rage as he realized his carefully laid plans crumbling. Then I'll simply have to ensure you don't live long enough to explore this revelation, he snarled, lunging forward with his enchanted blade. But Kaelen was ready for him. 15 years of warrior training hadn't been forgotten. And without the crushing weight of artificial guilt clouding his judgment, his reflexes proved as sharp as ever. He caught Brennan's wrist, redirecting the blade's path while his other hand struck a precise blow to the man's throat. Brennan stumbled backward, gasping, but managed to keep hold on his weapon. The crystal orb rolled across the floor toward him, its surface now flickering between darkness and transparency as the power sustaining it wavered. "You cannot destroy what took 15 years to create," Brennan wheezed, raising the blade again. "Even if you break free, there are others dozens of vessels across the continent, each one feeding the greater working. Then we'll find them," Serenya said firmly, her hand still clasped in Kaelen's. "We'll help them understand the truth about their curses, just as we've understood the truth about this one." The simple declaration of shared purpose, "we," sent another surge of warm light through the chamber. The crystal orb cracked audibly, its surface developing fissures that leaked pale radiance instead of darkness. Brennan looked at the failing orb with desperate fury, then back at the two figures whose connection was systematically dismantling. 15 years of careful magical manipulation. "If I cannot maintain the curse," he said with cold finality, "then I'll ensure you both die before it can be fully broken." He raised the enchanted blade above his head, dark energy crackling along its edge. But before he could strike, the chamber door burst open and Sir Aldrich rushed in, his own sword drawn and ready. "I thought I might find you here," the older knight said grimly, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. "Though I admit the magical light show was more dramatic than I expected." The interruption provided the distraction Kaelen needed. Moving with the fluid grace of long training, he stepped forward and delivered a precise blow that sent Brennan's weapon spinning from numb fingers. The enchanted blade clattered against the wall and went dark, its power severed from its wielder. Brennan staggered backward, his eyes fixed on the crystal orb as its cracks spread wider and brighter light leaked through its fractured surface. "No," he whispered. 15 years of work cannot be undone by a single moment of misguided sentiment. The orb shattered. The explosion of released energy was not violent, but transformative, a wave of liberation that swept through the chamber and beyond. Kaelen felt the last artificial bonds of guilt and self-blame dissolve, replaced by clarity and peace he hadn't known since boyhood. The supernatural chill that had followed him for 15 years evaporated like morning mist before sunshine. Brennan collapsed to his knees amid the crystal fragments, his face aged by decades in an instant as the dark magic that had sustained him for so long was suddenly withdrawn. "The master will not be pleased," he whispered, then fell forward unconscious in the sudden silence that followed. Kaelen became aware of Serenya's hand still warm in his, of Aldrich's satisfied smile, of the natural firelight dancing on chamber walls, no longer touched by supernatural shadow. "Is it over?" Serenya asked softly. Kaelen considered the question carefully, testing his emotions for any lingering trace of artificial compulsion. He found only his own genuine feelings, complex and deep, but unquestionably his own. "The curse is broken," he said with wonder. "For the first time in 15 years, I'm truly free." But even as he spoke the words, he knew this was only the beginning. Brennan had mentioned other vessels, other people trapped in webs of manufactured despair across the continent. The work of liberation had only just begun, and he would not be doing that work alone. Dawn broke gray and somber over Ravenshollow Castle, its pale light filtering through the tall windows of the king's private council chamber. The events of the previous night had sent shockwaves through the court's carefully ordered hierarchy, and by royal decree, all those involved found themselves summoned before the throne to account for their actions. Kaelen stood at attention beside Sir Aldrich, both knights still bearing the tension of the supernatural confrontation that had shattered 15 years of careful magical manipulation. Across the chamber, Sir Bren sat under heavy guard, his aged features bearing witness to the dark magic that had sustained him for so long and then been abruptly withdrawn. The crystal fragments of the vessel of sorrow had been gathered into a sealed chest, but their power was gone, dissipated into harmless sparkles that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Lady Serenya occupied a chair near the chamber's center, her composed bearing masking the exhaustion that came from a night spent researching ancient magics and confronting supernatural forces. The silver rose brooch at her throat seemed to glow with its own inner light, and Kaelen found his eyes drawn to it repeatedly as they waited for the king's arrival. Nervous? Aldrich asked quietly, his weathered face creased with concern for his former student. Not about the king's judgment, Kaelen replied truthfully, but about what comes next. Breaking the curse was only the beginning. Brennan mentioned others. Dozens of people across the continent trapped in similar webs of artificial despair. One battle at a time, the older knight counseled. Today we deal with the immediate aftermath. Tomorrow we can begin planning the larger campaign. The great doors opened with ceremonial gravitas, and King Aldwin entered flanked by his personal guard and court advisors. The monarch was a man in his middle years, his brown hair touched with silver, and his intelligent eyes holding the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. He had ruled justly for 2 decades, earning the loyalty of his knights and the respect of neighboring kingdoms through wisdom and measured strength. "Rise," the king commanded as the assembled figures offered their respects. His gaze swept the chamber, taking in the unusual gathering with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to unraveling complex situations. We find ourselves faced with circumstances that strain the boundaries of normal jurisprudence. Magic and conspiracy, foreign infiltration, and supernatural manipulation matters that require careful consideration rather than hasty judgment. He settled into his chair of state, its carved back depicting the royal arms in gold and azure. "Sir Aldrich, as the senior knight present and witness to last night's events, present your account of what transpired." Aldrich stepped forward with military precision, his report delivered in the clear, concise language of a man who had briefed commanders across 2 decades of service. He outlined the investigation into Bran's background, the discovery of magical text describing curse mechanics, and a confrontation that had revealed the true nature of the supernatural forces at work. "In summary, Your Majesty," he concluded, "Sir Kaelen has been the victim of an elaborate magical deception designed to harvest his emotional suffering for purposes we are only beginning to understand. Sir Brennan served as an agent of hostile foreign forces, tasked with maintaining that deception and preventing its exposure." The king's attention shifted to Serenya, his expression thoughtful. "Lady Serenya, your role in these discoveries appears to have been crucial. What moved you to investigate matters that had remained hidden for 15 years? She rose gracefully, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's solemn atmosphere. "I recognized the signs of trauma disguised as supernatural affliction. Your Majesty, having witnessed similar phenomena in the border territories, I suspected that Sir Kaelen's supposed curse might be more complex than it appeared. And your research led you to what conclusions? That true magic was indeed involved, but not in the way anyone believed." Her eyes briefly met Kaelen's across the chamber, drawing strength from the connection that had helped break the curse. The enemy sorcerer had created a weapon that turned the victim's own guilt and grief against them, trapping them in cycles of isolation that fed power back to the magical working source. The king nodded slowly, his fingers steepled as he processed the implications. A weapon that creates its own fuel from human suffering, ingenious in its cruelty and potentially far-reaching in its applications. His gaze hardened as it fixed on the bound figure of Sir Brennan. "What can you tell us about the scope of this conspiracy?" Brennan raised his head with visible effort, his features bearing the ravages of his magical patron's withdrawal. "You understand nothing," he said, his voice hoarse but still carrying traces of fanatic conviction. "The great working has been building for decades, drawing power from nodes of despair across the known world. Even with this vessel destroyed, dozens more remain active. And their purpose?" The king pressed. "To prepare the way for our master's return." Brennan's eyes glittered with malevolent satisfaction despite his defeat. "The accumulated sorrow of generations will fuel a resurrection that your armies cannot prevent and your magic cannot counter." The revelation sent a chill through the chamber that had nothing to do with supernatural forces. A conspiracy spanning decades, with tentacles reaching across multiple kingdoms, represented a threat of unprecedented scope. Kaelen found himself thinking of all the isolated, guilt-ridden individuals who might be unknowingly feeding power to such a working knights haunted by battlefield losses, mothers grieving dead children, lovers separated by tragedy and convinced their affection brought only harm. "Your Majesty," he said, stepping forward despite the breach of protocol. "If Sir Brennan speaks truly, then this matter extends far beyond the boundaries of a single court case. We face a threat that requires coordinated response across multiple kingdoms." The king studied him with interest. "You speak of we, Sir Kaelen. Do you consider yourself equipped to address such far-reaching challenges?" It was the moment Kaelen had been both dreading and anticipating since the curse's destruction. For 15 years, his life had been defined by limitation and isolation, by careful avoidance of anything that might risk harm to others. Now, suddenly, he found himself contemplating exactly the opposite, a quest that would require him to seek out danger, to form connections with strangers, to risk everything in service of a cause larger than his personal suffering. "I believe I must try, Your Majesty," he replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "The curse that trapped me was broken through understanding and connection, not through magical force or military might. Others suffering under similar enchantments will meet someone who comprehends their plight from personal experience. And you would not undertake such a mission alone," the king observed, his knowing gaze shifting to include Serenya in his assessment. "No, Your Majesty." Kaelen turned to meet her eyes directly, drawing courage from the warmth and determination he saw there. Lady Serenya's research proved crucial to understanding the curse's true nature. Her knowledge of magical theory and her insight into trauma's effects would be invaluable in helping others break free of similar bonds. The lady must speak for herself regarding such dangerous undertakings, the king said diplomatically, though his tone suggested he had already guessed her answer. Serenya rose with quiet dignity, her silver rose brooch catching the morning light. As she faced the throne, "I would be honored to assist in such work, Your Majesty. The border territories have given me experience with various forms of magical manipulation, and I have personal reasons for wishing to see such cruelties ended." The hint of her own tragic past, carefully controlled but never fully healed, added weight to her commitment. Kaelen realized that her willingness to help him had been motivated by more than academic curiosity or romantic attraction. She understood the burden of carrying undeserved guilt because she carried similar burdens herself. "Then we find ourselves facing a decision that will shape the next phase of this kingdom's history," the king said gravely. "Do we treat this as an isolated incident to be resolved through normal judicial channels, or do we recognize it as the opening move in a larger conflict requiring extraordinary measures?" The question hung in the chamber's air like a sword balanced on its point. Around them, court advisors and guards waited for guidance that would determine not only their immediate actions, but potentially the fate of kingdoms, yet unaware of the supernatural threat growing in their midst. "Your Majesty," Sir Aldrich said, carefully, "if I may offer counsel based on long experience with military threats, the enemy's strategy appears to rely on secrecy and isolation. They have succeeded for decades by keeping their victims ignorant of the true nature of their afflictions. preventing any coordinated response. You suggest we counter with openness and connection, the king mused. Precisely. By revealing the truth about these artificial curses, by helping the afflicted understand that their suffering serves an enemy purpose, we can begin to dismantle the network that sustains the larger magical working. The wisdom of the approach was evident, but so were its challenges. Such a mission would require resources, diplomatic coordination, and above all, individuals with the knowledge and courage to seek out cursed victims across potentially hostile territories. Sir Kaelen, the king said finally, you have served this crown faithfully for 15 years, despite laboring under a burden that would have broken lesser men. If we were to commission such a mission, to seek out and liberate others trapped in supernatural snares, would you accept command of such an undertaking? The formal offer struck Kaelen with the force of destiny itself. Everything in his life had been building toward this moment, the tragedy that had shaped him, the isolation that had taught him empathy for others suffering similar fates, the curse that had paradoxically prepared him to recognize and counter such magical manipulations. I would, Your Majesty, he replied without hesitation, though I would request that Lady Serenya be granted equal authority in all matters relating to the mission's magical aspects. Her expertise complements my own, and the work we began together should continue as a partnership. The king's smile suggested he had been hoping for exactly such a response. Then, let it be recorded that we hereby establish the Order of Liberated Hearts, charged with seeking out victims of supernatural manipulation and providing them with the knowledge and support needed to break free of their artificial bonds. Sir Kaelen will serve as Knight Commander, with Lady Serenya as Scholar Advocate. The formal titles carried weight beyond their words: recognition of purpose, authorization to act with royal authority, and most importantly, acknowledgement that their connection had become something larger than personal affection. They were partners in a cause that would require them to face dangers and challenges neither could overcome alone. The mission will require careful preparation, the king continued. Maps of suspected curse sites, diplomatic credentials for travel through foreign territories, resources for extended campaigns. Sir Aldrich, I trust you will oversee the practical arrangements? Of course, Your Majesty. Though I would request permission to accompany the initial expedition. My experience may prove valuable, and frankly, I have no intention of letting these two attempt such dangers without proper support. The older knight's protective instincts brought warmth to Kaelen's chest that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the bonds of friendship and loyalty that had sustained him through his darkest years. Whatever lay ahead, he would not face it without the people who mattered most to him. But first, there was something he needed to do, something that had been building in his heart since the moment the curse shattered and left him truly free to choose his own path forward. The great tournament ground of Raven's Hollow buzzed with anticipation as nobles and commoners alike gathered for what had been announced as a special exhibition of arms. Word had spread through the castle and surrounding villages that Sir Kaelen, the mysteriously cursed knight who had lived in isolation for 15 years, would make a public appearance to demonstrate his skills against selected opponents. What the crowd didn't know was that Kaelen had requested this gathering for an entirely different purpose. Standing in the armory beneath the tournament stands, he adjusted the unfamiliar weight of his ceremonial armor, while his heart hammered against his ribs with nervousness that had nothing to do with combat. "You're certain about this?" Sir Aldrich asked for the third time, his weathered fingers helping to secure the polished steel plates that caught the morning sunlight streaming through high windows. Public declarations have a way of taking on lives of their own, especially when the entire court is watching. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Kaelen replied, though his voice carried the slight tremor of a man about to step off a cliff into unknown territory. 15 years of hiding behind duty and fear, If I'm to lead this mission to free others from their artificial prisons, I need to demonstrate that I've truly freed myself from mine. Through the armory's thick walls came the sound of trumpets announcing the commencement of festivities. In a few moments, he would walk onto that field before hundreds of witnesses and speak words that would change everything, not just for himself, but for the woman whose courage and insight had made his liberation possible. The ring? Aldrich inquired quietly. Kaelen's hand moved to the pouch at his belt, where Lyanna's wedding band rested alongside a new ring he had commissioned from the castle's finest goldsmith. The old ring represented a past he needed to honor, but no longer needed to carry as a burden. The new ring represented a future he was finally brave enough to claim. I have it, he confirmed. Both of them. And Lady Serenya knows nothing of what you plan. Nothing. The admission brought both excitement and terror. I want her choice to be completely free, made without pressure from public expectation or private conversation. She spent weeks helping me understand that the curse was built from artificial compulsion. I won't risk binding her to me through anything similar. Aldrich's smile held both pride and affection for the young man he had helped raise from traumatized boy to confident knight. She say yes, he said with quiet certainty. I've seen how she looks at you, how she moves closer when you're in the same room without seeming to realize she's doing it. That's not duty or pity. That's love recognizing its match. The words brought warmth that had nothing to do with the armor's weight or the day's growing heat. In the weeks since the curse's breaking, Kaelen had discovered feelings he had thought lost forever. Not just the ability to care for another person, but the deeper capacity to trust that such caring could be reciprocated without bringing disaster. Sir Kaelen? A young page appeared in the armory doorway, his face flushed with excitement at being part of such momentous events. The herald requests your presence. The crowd is assembled, and her ladyship has taken her place in the royal box. As you requested, this was it, the moment when 15 years of careful isolation would end forever, replaced by whatever lay on the other side of courage. Kaelen drew a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the sunlight streaming through the archway that led to the tournament ground. The roar that greeted his appearance nearly overwhelmed him. Hundreds of voices raised an appreciation for the knight who had served faithfully despite his mysterious burden, who had faced down supernatural threats and emerged victorious. But his attention fixed immediately on the royal box, where Serenya sat beside the king and queen, her green eyes wide with surprise at the public nature of whatever he had planned. She wore a gown of deep sapphire blue that brought out the auburn highlights in her carefully arranged hair, and the silver rose brooch at her throat seemed to glow with reflected sunlight. Her beauty struck him anew, but it was the intelligence in her gaze and the strength in her bearing that made his heart race with anticipation. The herald raised his staff for silence, and gradually the crowd's enthusiasm settled into expectant quiet. In that hushed moment, Kaelen could hear his own heartbeat, the distant sound of banners snapping in the breeze, and the whisper of his armor as he moved to the center of the field. "Lords and ladies of Ravenshollow," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the tournament ground's natural acoustics. "I stand before you today not to demonstrate skills with sword and shield, but to speak a truth I have hidden for too long." The crowd's attention sharpened, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. In the royal box, Serenya leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. 15 years ago, I believed myself cursed, doomed to bring harm to any woman who dared care for me. That belief kept me isolated, afraid to risk my heart or anyone else's safety. But recently, through the wisdom and courage of one remarkable lady, I learned that the greatest curse was not magical compulsion, but my own fear of living fully. He reached into the pouch at his belt, drawing out both rings so the crowd could see the symbolism of his gesture. Lyanna's ring caught the light, first a simple band of silver, that had represented his longest-held dreams. Beside it, the new ring gleamed with fresh promise, its surface unmarked by tears or regret. "I haven't touched a woman in 15 years," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent field. "But today, I choose to end that isolation forever." The silence that followed Kaelen's declaration stretched across the tournament ground like a held breath. Hundreds of faces turned between the knight standing alone on the field and the lady in the royal box, whose own expression had shifted from surprise to wonder to something deeper and more radiant. "Lady Serenya of Ashworth," Kaelen continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his courage, "you saw through the walls I built around my heart. You refused to accept that isolation was safety, that distance was protection. You taught me that love freely given is stronger than any curse, and that connection chosen despite fear is the most powerful magic of all." In the royal box, Serenya rose slowly to her feet, her hands pressed to her heart as if to contain its racing rhythm. The silver rose brooch at her throat seemed to pulse with inner light, responding to emotions too strong to be contained by mere jewelry. "You helped me understand that the prison I called a curse was built from my own guilt and maintained by my own choices," Kaelen said, holding up Lyanna's ring so the sunlight caught its worn silver surface. "This ring belonged to the first woman. I loved the girl who died because I wasn't strong enough to protect her. For 15 years, I carried it as a reminder of my failures, a weight that kept me bound to the past." The crowd watched in fascination as he walked toward the royal box, his armor catching the light with each step. Several nobles in the lower seats moved aside to create a clearer path, sensing they were witnessing something that would be remembered and recounted for generations. "But you taught me that honoring the dead doesn't require imprisoning the living," he continued, now standing directly below the royal box where she could see every detail of his face. "Lyanna would not have wanted her memory to become my cage. She would have wanted me to live, to love, to find the happiness that was stolen from us both." With deliberate ceremony, he opened his hand and let Lyanna's ring fall to the earth at his feet, not cast aside in disrespect, but gently released like a bird returning to freedom. The gesture sent a ripple of understanding through the assembled crowd, many of whom had heard whispered versions of his tragic history. "I release the past," he declared, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the tournament ground. "Not to forget it, but to honor it properly by building something beautiful from the wisdom it taught me." Now he held up the new ring, a band of gold so pure it seemed to capture and hold the sunlight itself. Its surface was unmarked by sorrow, unweighted by regret, bright with the promise of futures yet to be written. "Lady Serenya," he said, his voice dropping to carry intimate meaning despite the public setting, "will you come down here and help me prove that love conquers fear?" The request hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 15 years of isolation and leading toward possibilities neither had dared imagine when they first met in the castle's great hall. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that her answer would determine not just the fate of two people, but the success of the larger mission they had been charged to undertake. Serenya looked down at him for a long moment, her green eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. Then, with the decisive grace that had first captured his attention, she gathered her skirts and moved toward the stairs leading down from the royal box. The crowd parted like water before her as she descended, creating a clear path to where Kaelen waited. Her steps quickened as she drew closer, until by the time she reached the tournament field proper, she was nearly running toward him. "Yes," she said, as she came within arm's reach, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden hush. "Yes to all of it, the mission, the partnership, the love that's stronger than any artificial curse." Without hesitation, she extended her hand toward him, palm up, fingers steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The silver rose brooch at her throat blazed with light that seemed to come from within rather than from the sun above. Kaelen reached, out with his own hand, moving slowly and deliberately so that every person in the crowd could witness the moment when his self-imposed isolation finally ended. When their palms touched, when their fingers intertwined, when 15 years of careful distance collapsed into connection, chosen freely by both participants, the crowd erupted. No supernatural winds howled across the tournament ground. No flowers withered in their beds around the field's perimeter. No candles flickered with ominous warning. Instead, warmth spread outward from their joined hands like ripples in a clear pond, and those closest to them later swore they felt it as a physical sensation, not heat, but the deeper warmth that comes from witnessing genuine love triumph over manufactured despair. "I love you," Kaelen said, the words simple but carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I love you too," Serenya replied, her voice strong and certain despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I have since that first night in the garden when you trusted me enough to speak Liana's name." He slipped the golden ring onto her finger, the metal seeming to glow with its own inner light as it settled into place. The fit was perfect, not by magical compulsion, but by careful attention to detail and the simple desire to offer her something beautiful and meaningful. "Will you marry me?" he asked, though the answer was already clear in her radiant smile and the way she stepped closer, despite the hundreds of watching eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to marriage. Yes to partnership. Yes to whatever adventures lie ahead for the order of liberated hearts." And then, because some moments transcend public protocol and private restraint alike, he kissed her thoroughly, passionately, and with 15 years' worth of pent-up devotion finally given free expression. The crowd's roar of approval seemed to shake the very foundations of Ravenshollow Castle, but neither of them heard it. They were lost in each other, in the miracle of connection chosen freely and maintained without fear, in the revolutionary discovery that love honestly given was indeed stronger than any curse that dark magic could devise. The chapel bells of Ravenshollow Castle rang with joyous celebration as the sun reached its zenith, their bronze voices carrying across the countryside to announce the wedding of Sir Kaelen Thorne and Lady Serenya Ashworth. What had begun as a public declaration of love had transformed, by unanimous consent of king and court, into an immediate ceremony of marriage. "I've never seen anything quite like it," King Aldwin remarked to his queen as they watched the newlyweds. "Accept congratulations from a seemingly endless line of well-wishers, a curse broken by courage, a proposal made before hundreds of witnesses, and a wedding celebrated by royal decree, all in the span of a single afternoon." Queen Isabel smiled as she observed the radiant couple. "Some stories demand to be told." "Completely, my lord. This was never going to be a quiet courtship conducted over months of careful negotiation. It required the kind of dramatic gesture that transforms individuals into legends." Indeed, the transformation was already evident in how others looked at them. No longer was Kaelen the mysterious, isolated knight haunted by supernatural forces. He had become the champion who proved that love could triumph over the darkest magic. That connection, freely chosen, was stronger than any curse. And Serenya was no longer simply a visiting noblewoman. With scholarly interests, she had become the wise lady whose courage and insight had helped break 15 years of magical bondage. Sir Aldrich approached the couple as the initial wave of congratulations began to ebb, his weathered face bright with paternal pride. In his hands, he carried a silk-wrapped bundle that drew curious glances from nearby courtiers. "A wedding gift," he explained, presenting the package to Serenya with courtly grace. "Something I've been saving for this day, though I confess I never quite imagined it would arrive with such dramatic timing." Inside the silk wrapping lay a sword unlike any Kaelen had ever seen. The blade seemed to capture and hold light rather than simply reflecting it, and symbols etched along its fuller glowed with the same warm radiance that had emanated from Serenya's pendant during their moments of deepest connection. It was forged by the same smiths who created the weapons that originally defeated the sorcerer's forces 15 years ago. Aldrich explained. I commissioned it when you first arrived at court, believing someday you would need a blade designed specifically to counter dark magic rather than merely deflect it. Kaelen accepted the weapon with reverence, testing its weight and balance with the practiced motions of a lifetime warrior. The sword felt alive in his hands, responding to his touch with subtle warmth that suggested it had been waiting long years to serve its intended purpose. Thank you, he said simply, the words carrying depths of gratitude that formal language could not encompass. For this gift, for your guidance, for believing I could become more than my fears allowed. The blade will serve you well in the work ahead, Aldrich replied, and the work will be considerable. Our preliminary investigations suggest at least 30 locations across the continent where similar curse networks may be operating. Each site will require careful approach, thorough investigation, and probably significant personal risk. Serenya moved closer to her new husband, her hand finding his with the natural ease of partnership already formed. We'll face whatever comes. Together, she said with quiet confidence. The techniques we use to break Kaelen's curse can be adapted for other victims, other situations. And we won't be working alone, Kaelen added, his gaze encompassing the crowd of well-wishers who had witnessed their union. What happened here today, the public nature of the curse-breaking, the celebration of love overcoming fear, it's already inspiring others to question their own limitations and artificial constraints. It was true. Throughout the afternoons, festivities, various courtiers had approached them with whispered confessions of their own struggles, guilt over past failures, fear of emotional connection, self-imposed isolation disguised as duty or propriety. Not all were victims of supernatural manipulation, but many carried burdens that served similar purposes in limiting their capacity for joy and meaningful relationship. The Order of Liberated Hearts may find more recruits than we initially anticipated, Serenya observed with satisfaction. There's something about witnessing genuine transformation that makes people believe their own changes are possible. As evening approached and the formal celebrations began winding toward their natural conclusion, the newlyweds found themselves alone for the first time since their public declaration. They walked together through the rose garden where their first real conversation had taken place, now transformed by the absence of supernatural shadow into a place of pure beauty and natural peace. Do you have any regrets? Kaelen asked as they paused beside the marble bench where she had first challenged his assumptions about his curse, about the speed of today's events, the public nature of our commitment, the dangerous mission we've accepted. Serenya turned to face him fully, her green eyes reflecting starlight as night settled over the castle grounds. My only regret is that it took us so long to reach this point, she replied honestly. I knew from that first evening in the Great Hall that you were someone worth fighting for. I just had to convince you that you were worth fighting for yourself. He drew her closer, marveling at the simple freedom to offer and receive affection without fear of supernatural consequences. The moonstone pendant at her throat glowed softly, no longer responding to artificial magical tensions, but simply reflecting the natural warmth of human connection, freely chosen and deeply felt. What do you think our first destination should be? He asked, his mind already turning toward the challenges ahead. Aldrich mentioned reports from the eastern provinces about unusually high rates of melancholy among young widows, and the southern territories have several accounts of knights who withdrew from service after specific traumatic battles. We'll study the patterns, identify the most urgent cases, and begin with those victims whose situations most closely parallel your own experience, she replied pragmatically. But for tonight, for our wedding night, could we perhaps focus on celebrating what we've accomplished rather than planning what comes next? A gentle reminder brought his attention back to the present moment. to the miraculous reality of having someone to share both burdens and joys with after 15 years of careful solitude. Tomorrow would bring the serious work of planning their first mission, of coordinating with royal authorities, of preparing for dangers that might make their recent confrontation with Brennan seem simple by comparison. But tonight belonged to us, to them, to the discovery of what marriage meant when both partners came to it freely, without compulsion or artificial constraints, with nothing but genuine love and mutual respect as their foundation. "You're absolutely right," he said, lifting her hand to his lips to press a gentle kiss against the golden ring that marked her as his wife. "Tonight is for us. Tomorrow we begin saving the world." Her laughter, bright as silver bells in the gardens, peaceful atmosphere, seemed to bless their future endeavors with the same joy that had marked the breaking of his curse. Whatever challenges lay ahead for the order of liberated hearts, they would face them as partners equals in courage, wisdom, and the revolutionary belief that love freely given was indeed the strongest force in any realm, magical or mundane. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to vows spoken and destinies chosen, to curses broken and futures claimed. And in the rose garden of Ravenshollow Castle, two people who had found each other across the gulf of fear and artificial despair began the first chapter of a story that would inspire hope in hearts across the known world. The curse was broken. The mission was clear. And love, as it always had and always would, had found a way to triumph over the darkness that sought to keep human hearts apart.